This is a story of a relatively obscure Canadian painter who dedicated his life to the preservation of an almost unknown segment of Canadian history. The painter is William Edgar Cantelon. He was born in 1866 and died in 1950. The principal location of his work was in the former county of Norfolk, situated in southwestern Ontario on the shore of Lake Erie. It is an area which had a considerable role in the settlement of the Loyalists after the Revolution in the United States, an area which had a substantial part in the War of 1812-14, and an active involvement in the Rebellion of 1837. At the peak of his painting career, Cantelon began to recognize Norfolk's historical heritage and to realize that within his lifetime, important elements of local heritage were about to be lost. There were aging neighbors who remembered the rebellion, whose parents had told them of stories of the 1812-14 conflict, and whose grandparents had related their incredible experience while settling in the wilderness of Upper Canada. At the same time, the original wooden buildings and early monuments were also disappearing. Cantelon realized that with his skills as a painter, he had the ability to preserve some of this history. In a systematic manner, he began to record on canvas those early historic days of Norfolk. And there is considerable history in Norfolk County. When Colonel John Graves Simcoe became Lieutenant Governor of Upper 1792, he recognized the military threat from the United States and developed a defensive strategy. A capital was to be located inland in London, with 3 large mutually supporting forts at York on Lake Ontario, Gloucester on Lake Huron, and Long Point on Lake Erie. Near the base of Long Point, the town of Charlotteville was to be built, complete with fortifications and a naval harbor. In the heavily forested and almost unpopulated region of Long Point, Simcoe decided to settle a dependable and energetic group of people, the Loyalists, fleeing from the United States. Generous land grants were offered to former soldiers and their families. Property was surveyed and roads constructed. Although Governor Simcoe's successors did not follow the original plan, the land filled up quickly, with people willing to accept the hardships of pioneers in order to start a new life. Following the Loyalists in rapid succession, looking for good, cheap land, were Americans of other extractions and persuasions.
By 1810, there were approximately 140,000 settlers in Upper Canada, although less than 1/4 were Loyalists. The non-Loyalists were a major concern when the War of 1812-14 commenced. Furthermore, a shortage of British troops and an inability by England to reinforce them meant that Indian allies and local militia units had to fight as soldiers rather than serve in supporting roles. In Norfolk County, volunteers from the 2 militia regiments joined General Brock in the capture of Detroit and fought in a series of battles along the Niagara frontier. In September 1813, the British naval force lost control of Lake Erie, and it was no longer possible to supply the military forces in the western part of the province. Troops were withdrawn, and the region left vulnerable to attack. Norfolk County was a particularly attractive target. At this time, it was a major source of food and forest products for domestic consumption, military supplies, and foreign trade. and the enemy did not neglect the opportunity to attack. Two groups of raiders made up of former American settlers landed by boat and commenced a campaign of theft and pillage. In November 1813, the Norfolk militia overtook one group of raiders near Nanticoke. They captured or killed the majority and drove the remainder into the woods. On May the 14th, 1814, an American military force aboard 5 ships landed at Port Dover. They burned the mills and the village and killed the livestock, sparing only one house. The next day, they attacked Port Ryerson and burned the mills. In the autumn of 1814, a final blow was delivered. A mounted group of approximately 700 Americans with another 700 Indian allies left Detroit and raced along the Dundas Road. They were unopposed until they reached Oakland, where both Norfolk regiments had gathered. Outflanked by the Indians and outnumbered by the Americans, the militiamen were forced to withdraw. The enemy then swept through the country, capturing prisoners, killing livestock, and burning most of the mills until they returned to Detroit via the Lakeshore Road. The war ended in 1814, but the pillage in Norfolk left extensive damage and bitter memories that lasted much longer.
In 1837, the Norfolk militia had a substantial role during the uprising in Western Canada. While William Lyon Mackenzie's brief rebellion on Yonge Street in Toronto was an immediate failure, it was reported in this area to have been a huge success. Consequently, the rural dissidents in the surrounding townships who had been organized previously were ordered to assemble in the village of Scotland. The rebel strategy was to march to Brantford, then take Hamilton, and join forces with Mackenzie to complete the seizure of Toronto. The Western leaders, while waiting for their forces to assemble, learned that Mackenzie had been defeated. An immediate decision was made to retreat to the village of Norwich to gain time. By now, loyal forces from Hamilton were marching toward them from the east, while troops from London closed from the west. From the south came the Norfolk militia. The result was that the majority of the rebels were captured in Norwich, while the remainder, with their supporters, quickly dispersed or fled to the United States. There was no further military action, and the militia was not summoned for duty again until the Fenian raids became a local threat in the 1860s. This was the era in Norfolk County that Edgar Cantelon wanted to preserve on canvas. He was born in 1866 near Streetsville in Halton County, Ontario. As recalled many years later, he became interested in drawing and painting at an early age.
Yes, that's right. When I was a barefooted boy on a pioneer farm, the one thing in which I took delight was sketching and painting. In fact, I cannot recall a time when I was not more interested in art than in any of the dull farm tasks which I shared with my brothers and sisters. Of course, like most boys, I tried to escape these boring tasks, but I soon learned this did not pay. My neglect usually resulted in additional chores, so I hurried through the disagreeable jobs as quickly as I could, so I might have more time to spend with my pencil and colors. It started when my brothers and sisters and I attended a little country school in the valley of the Credit River, near Toronto. Not far from the river was a spot where, by careful searching, one might find stones in a variety of colors. Now, as I look back, I believe these must have been clay, not stone, as they were soft enough to be used on our slates. We came back from our searches with our pockets filled. For a while, we were busy covering our slates with colorful designs. But gradually, most of the boys lost interest, and I became the proud possessor of their abandoned treasures.
Did this ever get you into trouble?
Well, yes, it most decidedly did. Frequently, I became absorbed during school hours, covering my slate with drawings, usually full of action, the kind that appeals to schoolboys, and frequently amusing. They soon attracted the attention of boys and girls who neglected their books to watch what I was drawing. Of course, this did not long escape the notice of our teacher, and I would be marched to the front of the school to show what I had drawn. Unhappily, it was sometimes a portrait of you-know-who. I was always reprimanded for wasting my time when I should have been studying spelling, and then he would bring out the blue beach switch. Ouch! The fun things which meant so much to other boys did not appeal to me. I'm sure my schoolmates, and even my brothers and sisters, bless them, thought me strange, but my parents were wise enough to humor my strangeness. Father would ask in an encouraging way, "What have you drawn today?" And when I hesitatingly produced my latest effort for his inspection, a word of kindly commendation from him was an additional inspiration to a boy who was, well, I guess, naturally timid and shy. My mother's contribution was more tangible, but no less helpful. To provide me with paper, which was a very scarce and costly article in a pioneer home, she would never forget to save for me the white paper in which the tea came from the little store. When this was carefully smoothed, folded, and stitched, it provided me with booklets for my drawings. But paper was not the only thing that was scarce and difficult to get. The father of a growing family on a pioneer farm had little money even for the necessities, and even if artist supplies had been abundant, they would have been a luxury that we could not afford. So I was forced to depend upon my own ingenuity. Brushes were a first necessity. If I could discover suitable hair, I was sure that I could devise some scheme for making a brush that would serve my purposes. None of the farm animals seemed to promise the proper hair type. Then, in the midst of my quandary, my eye fell upon Carlo, our mongrel dog that usually accompanied me as I wandered about in search of subjects for my sketches. There were long, bristly hairs in his ears that were somewhat stiff, yet offered needed flexibility. Yes, you guessed it. I selected and clipped enough for several brushes. Then, in the poultry yard, I found some large feathers. The quill of one of these I split along one side. Then, carefully arranging a bunch of hairs, I dipped one end in the glue and inserted it in the open quill. A piece of stray cord bound it tightly, and to my great joy, I found it had a serviceable brush, of which I was extremely proud. Of the hundreds of boughten brushes I have since used, none has given me such a thrill as did this childish product, to which good old Carlo and the gray gander had unwittingly contributed. Now I began my search for suitable colors. Everything seemed likely to serve was tried. Sometimes it was the juice of a berry, sometimes the petal of a flower.
During Cantelon's early years, he moved with his family from Streetsville to another farm in Woodhouse Township, just outside Port Dover. As a youth, he began entering his sketches and paintings in fairs, where he won a number of prizes. The recognition and publicity soon brought him requests from friends and neighbors, and his career was started. Sometime in the 1890s, or his mid-20s, he established a studio in Port Dover. His earliest dated paintings come from this period. In 1897, there was an advertisement regarding the Port Dover Furniture Emporium in Simcoe's newspaper, the British Canadian.
Henry Hoffman, proprietor, undertaker, and embalmer, manufacturer and dealer in furniture, picture framing, artist materials, crayon portraits, sewing machines, repairing neatly and promptly done. Special attention to ordered work. This is the largest furniture house in Port Dover. The premises at the corner of Market and St. Andrew Street comprise 2 buildings. This is also the headquarters of Mr. Cantelon, the famous crayon and pastel artist who has taken so many premiums at local fairs in Norfolk County and has won special prizes on his large paintings known as Despair and Eternity.
In 1900, an article in another local paper, the Dutton Advance, reported,
"An excellent portrait of the late Alexander McCallum is to be seen in Kirkland's window. This portrait is of particular interest because it has not been painted from sittings, nor from a photo in the usual way, but from 2 separate engravings of other gentlemen, parts of whose face bore a resemblance to Mr. McCallum, and from a minute description of the deceased, this striking likeness was secured. The artist who executed this difficult piece of work is Mr. W.E. Cantelon of Port Dover."
On April 5, 1901, the Port Dover Maple Leaf reported,
"We learn that Mr. W.E. Cantelon, the artist, will leave here shortly for a few months' study of the works of the great American and foreign masters in art galleries of New York and Chicago, and to take a short course in the studies of a leading Chicago artist. Mr. Cantelon has all the work he can attend to here, but is ambitious to advance himself in the higher branches of art. On his return, he will no doubt be prepared to give his patrons even better satisfaction than ever before."
There is no doubt the experience and formal instruction in the United States influenced his next period of painting. During the following 10 years, his work was on a larger scale. Many pieces were done in the more difficult media of oils and pastels. The subjects were expanded to include classical settings and allegorical figures and scenes, all of which were very popular at the time. He continued to enter his work in local fairs and more distant competitions. An edition of Toronto's Canadian National Exhibition catalogue in 1922 includes an entry from W.E. Cantelon titled The Archivist. Illustrations of his paintings indicate the scope of his interest included portraits, prize animals, still life, landscapes, story pictures, and religious murals. It is understood that his favorite mural was the crucifixion scene painted in Woodhouse United Church. A few years later, he moved his studio to the larger community of Simcoe. A notice in the British Canadian stated,
"The well-known artist, Mr. W.E. Cantelon, has opened a studio over Martin Brothers Music Store in this town. As an artist, he has an excellent reputation in landscape, portrait, and animal painting. Private lessons and classes are available."
A photograph of Cantelon at this time reveals a serious young man with sensitive features, projecting an impression of determination. This determination was to be well demonstrated later in his career. For the next 40 years, Cantelon was to work out of his upper floor studio in a building located near the corner of Norfolk and Peel Streets. His former students recollect that Cantelon's lifestyle seemed to be that of the traditional, non-materialistic artist. The studio was normally very crowded. There was a cluttered work area with adjacent walls covered with finished paintings for sale. In other areas, jumbled together, were brushes, paint, pencils, and unfinished sketches. The clutter grew with the relics Cantelon had begun collecting. Former pupils recalled that there was a couch for those cold winter nights when the artist worked very late. Meals at the nearby Getta's restaurant on the ground floor were cheap and filling. Groups of students and friends often met there for a sandwich. Cantelon's restricted finances meant he had to keep gas lighting in his studio long after most other establishments had converted to electricity. In 1917, a major event occurred in the artist's career. Cantelon sold John Ross Robertson, the founder of the Toronto Telegram and a keen historian, his first historical painting, that of the 1812-14 war trenches at Turkey Point. Cantelon recorded the incident.
You're right. It was 1917 when Mr. Robertson, who was a great collector, urged me to continue painting old landmarks of historical interest and, yes, portraits of men and women who played prominent parts in the district's early history. He declared that Norfolk and the district generally had been neglected, pictorially as well as historically, adding to me, "You have a rich field before you, Edgar." It would seem that I began this interesting work at a very opportune time when many of the older landmarks, dating from 1796 to 1825, were being torn down, and in some cases modernized by the addition of verandas or by replacing the large old fireplaces with modern chimneys. However, the majority of subjects were in their original shape. These comprised old courthouses, churches, towers, barracks, shops, and homes, many of which have since disappeared.
But Mr. Cantelon, didn't this give you some problems?
Well, yes, it did. Let me tell you of one of the many difficulties I had to overcome. One time I set out to secure a picture of the old Colonel Potts schoolhouse, in which the London District School was held during the years 1821-22, with Edgerton Ryerson, then under 20 years of age, as assistant teacher. I learned that the building had been moved to Victoria many years previously. After making a sketch of its original location, I proceeded to that village where Mr. Richard Terry, then in his 88th year, pointed out the old schoolhouse which was being used as a cow barn. Well, I found the old building in a fair state of preservation, but some windows were boarded over and the chimney was gone. After restoring these, in my picture, I was able to represent the old schoolhouse standing upon its original site at Potts Corners. Of course, books dealing with the history of pioneer times, old letters, and old newspapers furnished me with information which aided in locating my subjects. But after all, some of the most interesting information, legends, and romances were told to me by descendants of the pioneers as I went among them. This contact with the older people helped me to discover portraits and likenesses of many people, men and women, who had held a prominent position in the early life of the country. Some of these portraits were small and faded. Occasionally I discovered old portraits that had been painted from life before photography. Many persons have asked me how I managed to paint so many soldiers of 1812, 1814, and 1857 in their red or blue uniforms. While a few were from old oil portraits, the majority were from daguerreotypes and old drawings showing the subjects in civilian dress. But as many of their descendants had preserved their old uniforms, swords, and guns, I was able to dress them in those uniforms and place their sword or gun in their hands. So, after it became generally known through the country that I was engaged in this work, many interested persons searched their old trunks and garrets and found for me forgotten portraits and drawings of their ancestors. In this way, I was able to produce a gallery of portraits of the first settlers.
In the midst of this period of his painting, extensive plans were being made by others in Norfolk County for an old boys' reunion in 1924. Cantelon decided his contribution would be a display of historical paintings. It gave his mission new impetus, and he set about finding appropriate subjects throughout the county. During this time, Cantelon's lanky 6-foot figure in a black suit and wide-brimmed hat could be seen riding the back roads on a bicycle with a load of weeds for paint swinging in a cloth shopping bag on the handlebars. Returning home, he would carry bike and bag up to his room and paint well into the night. In time, Cantelon felt the display of paintings on historic subjects could be made more interesting if accompanied by heirlooms of the same period. Therefore, in addition to his personal collection, he began gathering clothing, household furnishings, tools, and weapons of the period. After some deliberation, it was decided that the growing display could be set up in the basement of the Simcoe Public Library. The exhibition was a great success, and it was decided to retain it on a permanent basis. Designated the Museum of Art and Antiques, it was opened by the Reeve of Norfolk and attended by the mayor of the town and a representative from the Royal Ontario Museum. Cantelon was appointed curator and probably received a modest salary. It was likely very modest, because in his memoirs the painter stated,
"It is doubtful if I should have been able to continue this line of work had I not received substantial encouragement from the late Guthrie Y. Barber of New York, who, through the years, purchased a total of 40 pieces.
In 1946, the museum and curator moved to much better accommodation in the Everbrook Donley home. The large Georgian residence had been bequeathed by the owner for this purpose. On the occasion of a meeting of the Ontario Historical Society in the new museum, the president, C.W. Jeffreys, congratulated the town of Simcoe, above all for its collection of drawings of local buildings and scenes from the brush of W.E. Cantelon, which renders the museum absolutely unique. He recognized the great contribution made by these paintings, which give today's generation an opportunity to see the likeness of the buildings that have passed into time. Mr. Jeffreys, Canada's most honored historical illustrator, praised the work of one he was pleased to style a fellow artist. William Edgar Cantelon died in 1950 at the age of 84. In one of a number of obituaries, it was stated,
Throughout his mature life, Mr. Cantelon devoted a great share of his time and talents to the task of creating, in permanent picture form, many historic scenes, old public buildings, churches and schools, as well as portraits of pioneer men and women. In all, he must have painted close to 500 historical pictures of this kind, requiring a vast amount of research and endless journeying from one end of Norfolk County to the other.
In concluding this presentation, it should be noted that W.E. Cantelon is not being portrayed as a great artist. Rather, his greatness results from his success in the creation of an accurate and realistic visual record of an historic period in his region of this country.